and one dot only, and was the only neuron that recognized it. This was a point-for-point reductive system, and take all those individual little neuron component parts, each of which that knows something about one dot, and put them together, and you could begin to get some information about what just hit the eye. What they then showed was the next layer of the cortex. And again, to simplify things as much as possible, what they began to see was you would now stimulate one of those retinal cells, and one neuron in the first layer of cortex would get excited. Nothing would happen in the second layer. Shift over, stimulate the next one over, nothing in the next part of the cortex. Over, and then suddenly one of the neurons in the second cortex gets excited. If and only if you first stimulate this photoreceptor, followed by this, followed by this, followed by this, followed by this, what does that neuron know about light moving in a straight line in this direction? That part of the cortex could extract the information from that first layer and put them together and get different sorts of information. And thus you would have another neuron there that would code for an angle that was slightly different, another one there, and then ones for different parts of the cortex, different parts of the visual system, and very long lines or very slow moving lights or things like that. What do neurons in that second layer know about? They know how to recognize straight lines. And you could see, again, this is a reductive system, because you know the wiring that goes from one layer, from the eye to this layer, and thus, if you know what's going on here, you can work backwards and know what's happening there and what's happening in the eye, and same in the other direction. A point-for-point system where now you're beginning to extract a higher level, a hierarchy of analysis, but the same exact reductionism. And just to then begin to show what they then went on to, again, this is very simplified. Now you begin to get neurons here. One of them will respond to this line. Another will respond to this line. Another will respond to this line, if and only if these three neurons are firing simultaneously. One neuron in the next layer of the visual cortex would fire. What do neurons there know about? Each one knows about a curve and one curve only. Same exact thing again, which is point-for-point reductionism. If you want to understand the system, you need to understand how every single neuron is wired to every next one in line. And once you got that, all you need to know is what information, what activity is happening at any level, and you've got 100% knowledge of what will be going on here and here and here, a purely reductive system. Everybody loved this. This was the greatest stuff that happened in neurobiology. This was arguably the most important work in neurobiology between like 1950, 1975. The two of them got their Nobel Prize. People would have given them a dozen if they could have, because what had they just solved? They just showed how the brain processes sensory information, how it extracts information from the world around and turns it into complex bits of sensory information, because it was completely obvious at this point what was going to happen, which was above this, there would be a layer that had neurons that could respond to a certain number of curves simultaneously. It can start seeing 3 dimensions, and then above that is one where the 3 dimensions are changing over time. It can detect movement of a 3-dimensional object. And the notion was you would be able to just go up layer after layer of reductive pointillist wiring, and way up on top you would have this super duper layer of visual cortical processing, and all the way up on top, somewhere up there, you would now have a neuron that knew one thing and one thing only, knew how to recognize your grandmother's face at this angle. And the notion would be that right next to it was another neuron that recognized your grandmother's face at this angle, and then one like this, and right behind were the rows of neurons recognizing your grandfather, and everybody decided, this is it. Just take this world of Hubel and Wiesel's stepwise extraction of information and keep going, and that's how the brain winds up recognizing faces. And meanwhile, people subsequently showed in the auditory cortex that the correspondence between one cochlear cell, one hair cell there, recognizing a single note. up to chords, up to OK. So now you go up enough layers there and you will find the layer that where single neurons will know your grandmother's favorite symphony. And that's it all the way up. You would eventually find neurons that were specialized in really complex sensory information, and all you had to do was just keep going like this in this purely reductive way, and you've got it up there on top. And people at the time actually did refer to these as grandmother neurons. The notion that enough layers up here, you would get neurons that responded to a really complex thing, and only to that, and it was the only neuron that responded to that point for point, one thing and one thing only, and that all you needed to do was just keep doing this, and you would eventually get neurons that recognized your grandmother. So right around the time that Hubel and Wiesel got their third layer here, and this took them about 15 years, they decided to go study something else in the visual system, and that turned out to be at least as interesting as this stuff. But everybody else leapt in at that point to try to find the next layer, and next layer, and next layer, and Hubel and Wiesel had shown a remarkable bit of wisdom or intuition by bailing on the field at that point, because to this day, hardly anybody has ever shown the existence of a grandmother neuron all the way down there. They simply don't exist. Okay, that's a lie. They do exist, but there's very few of them. There's sparse coding. Occasionally you find neurons that show grandmother neuron-like processes, neurons, a single neuron that will respond to a face and only one type of face, way up there in many layers of visual cortical processing. There are some of those. And there was a paper in Nature some years ago, which was one of the weirdest papers I have ever seen. Really interesting in terms of what it showed, but weird from the standpoint of what were these folks thinking to actually test this? And they were recording from the very upper layers of visual cortex in monkey brains, and they found some neurons that responded. One neuron would respond only to a certain human face, and coding a grandmother type neuron. Here's the bizarre thing in that paper. What they discovered were neurons in the brains of these rhesus monkeys where there would be a single grandmother-esque neuron, and what they found was a neuron that would respond to a picture of Jennifer Aniston. You think I'm being sarcastic. They found a Jennifer Aniston neuron which would respond to a photograph of her at all sorts of different angles, a caricature, all of that. They went and showed the grandmother specificity of this by showing that, and this is in the paper, it did not respond to Julia Roberts. It did not respond to Brad Pitt. Perhaps very meaningfully with that, it did not respond to Jennifer Aniston and Brad Pitt in the same picture. And God knows what was going on with Angelina Jolie with that. The one other, okay, this shows how bizarre it is. The one other thing they discovered this neuron would respond to was a picture of the Sydney Opera House. What's up with that? So this is a tube knowledge, almost a perfect reductive grandmother neuron. Bizarre thing being, what made these guys figure, I know, let's go get a picture of Jennifer Aniston and show it to the rhesus monkey and see what happens. Where'd that come from? I recall there was not a whole lot of illuminating information in the methods section as to where those sort of pictures came from, but so there are some of these. Some of them do exist, cases of what people in the field call sparse coding, where you only need a few neurons to recognize some really fancy things like Jennifer Aniston. Nonetheless, the vast majority of the attempts to find grandmother neurons failed dismally for a very simple reason. Okay, how many neurons do you need where each one knows one dot and one dot only? You need the exact same number of neurons as the number of photoreceptors in your retina. How many neurons do you need in this layer that turns these into lines? Well, you need one that's going to respond to a line of this length, and then one that will respond to this length, and one of this length, and one of that length, and then one that's a slightly different angle, and all that. You need like 10 times more neurons in this layer than this to be able to pull off that processing. How many neurons do you need in this layer? Like 10-fold, 100-fold more than here. And how come you don't even have the next layer, let alone grandmother neurons in any sort of numbers? Because you run out of neurons. There's not enough neurons in the brain, let alone the visual cortex, to process stuff that way. You can't have a layer above that because you run out of neurons. In other words, there's not enough neurons in the brain to do face recognition in a point-for-point reductive manner. The system breaks down because of lack of enough numbers of things. And what people have been doing ever since then, what's become the dominant sort of approach in that field, is an explicitly non-reductive approach, which is now looking at something called neural networks. Information, the really fancy complex information, like what everybody else from Friends looked like, except for the aniston neuron, really complex information is not coded for in a single protein, a single synapse, a single neuron. It's coded for in patterns of activation across hundreds, thousands of neurons, networks that are interacting. So you have a complete crashing and burning of what up to here seemed like the greatest demonstration of point-for-point reductive processing of sensory information, which just led you all the way up to grandmother neurons, and they basically don't exist because you run out of neurons at this point. You can't solve the problem of recognizing faces by using reductive component part neurobiology. Next domain where it falls apart as well. Okay, what do we have here? Either we've got a canal on Mars, or we've got a frost pattern on a window, or we've got a tree, or we've got a pattern of like lung branching or some sort. What do we have? We have a bifurcating system. And the characteristic of a bifurcating system is it is scale-free. On a certain level, if this is what a drainage line looks, you know, the Nile emptying out into sort of the Mediterranean as seen by a satellite, and if you're looking at the dendrites on one single neuron with an appropriate microscope, if you look at it formally in terms of the branching pattern, you can't tell which one you are looking at. The complexity of the branching is scale-free. So it turns out some of the most important things we have in our bodies are bifurcating systems. All the branch points on neurons are bifurcating. And maybe what we'll post is some amazing pictures of bifurcating dendritic trees on neurons, and they're called dendritic trees because they look just like trees. And when they get more complex for some reason, you are said to have increased their arborization, using terms straight out of treeology. So neuronal complexity in terms of its branch points. Look at the circulatory system, and it's the same thing as a bifurcating system. You've got your descending aorta, which is ascending here, and then it splits into two and splits into two and splits in, and it is a tree bifurcating into a whole bunch of little capillaries at the end. You look at the pulmonary system, and it is the exact same bifurcation coming down your trachea, which splits into two bronchos and then splits into bronchioles or whatever, and it's the same exact thing. So you've got this theme of bifurcating systems throughout living systems in the body, and notice the difference in scale. If this is blood vessels, we are talking about millions of cells making up the blood vessel walls, but here we are seeing potentially the exact same complexity of branching in a neuron that's a single cell, independent of scale. You can have just as complex branching coming off of a single neuron as the branching you're getting in a gazillion different capillaries in the tree of projections it comes from, the same exact degree of complexity. So now we come to the problem here, which is, so how does the body code for that? How does the body give out the instructions as to how to make a bifurcating system? And this is where you immediately run into trouble. What's a world we're sort of oriented to? In a purely reductive world, there is some sort of set of rules telling an aorta that's growing like this that there is some gene or genes which specify the point where this bifurcates. And this bifurcates and it's 2 inches in diameter or something. Meanwhile, at a later point where it's about an inch in diameter, it bifurcates. It's a different gene or set of genes that specifies this bifurcation. And another type of gene that specifies the next one, and those are obviously going to be totally different sorts of genes than specifying the same branching patterns in a neuron. This is one cell. Here you're having to specify thousands of cells, and at what point do they stop adhering in a certain way, so you can make a split there. And you look at this, and suddenly you got the same problem, which is there's not enough neurons that exist. There's not enough genes in the genome that exist to be able to code this way. You can't code for bifurcating systems in a living organism that covers completely different scales from one cell up to zillions of cells. You can't code for it in a point-for-point reductive way where the points down at the bottom, the component parts, are individual genes. You can't code for recognizing your grandmother with simple reductive component parts of neurons. You can't code for the bifurcating systems in the body because these will bifurcate out to millions of capillaries, and there's only 20,000 genes. The reductive approach breaks down here as well. Reductive point-for-point approaches break down when you get to the cortex trying to do something fancy like recognizing faces instead of dots, and it breaks down when you look at bifurcating systems that have to have a plan to split and then split and then split a million times to get all the capillaries out there. You can't code for it with a reductive approach because there's not enough neurons, there's not enough genes. Next way in which reductionism fails, and the notion that if you know the starting state, you'll know the complex version, and the other way around, all of that. And we've already gotten this. We got this back when in the molecular genetics lectures, which is the role of chance in these systems. All of that stuff we heard about sort of molecules vibrating Brownian motion, and what that winds up doing is when cells split, it's going to be unequal distributions of mitochondria. It's going to be things of that. Sheer chance is going to throw off your ability to deal with a reductive point-for-point system. You take identical twins, and they're each at the fertilized egg stage. And what you know in a reductive world is when it splits in two in this twin and splits in two in this twin, these are going to be, this cell is going to be identical with this one identical with this, all the way down to single molecules, because this is a reductive world in terms of how they split. And what we know is by the time a cell splits for the first time, this split is going to distribute the mitochondria between these two differently than distributed between these two. Even at the first cell division, chance is throwing off this ability to know the starting state and know what the complex system is going to be. So reductionism breaks down there as well, the fact that chance plays a role in any of these systems. The mitochondria wind up dividing unequally, the transcription factors, you remember all that stuff from there. Same exact thing with transposons, with genes jumping around. You throw in that randomizing chance element into there as well. You can't take the starting states and wind up building on it. An example in behavior, a guy named Ivan Chase, who does really interesting research with dominance behaviors, the emergence of dominance in different species. Okay, so you are going to have a colony of like 10 fish. And what you do initially is, each one of them is in a tank of their own, and you set up a round-robin tournament. You get every possible pairing of fish, you put them against each other, and you see which one is dominant of that pair. So you've done all of that, and you were able to derive a dominance hierarchy, where the number one fish is the one that dominated all the other 9 in those dyadic interactions. Number 2 dominated 8 of them, so on. It is simply a process, a syllogistic expansion to be able to then generate a dominance hierarchy. Pure, I know the starting state, every single dyad, and what the outcome was. I can now predict what the dominance hierarchy is going to be when you put all the fish together. And what he sees, of course, is once you actually get the fish together in a social group, there is no resemblance whatsoever. The dyadic pairing dominance outcomes has zero predictability over what the actual dominance hierarchy is going to be like. Why should that be? Because chance plays a role as well. You are a fish, and you've learned this transitivity stuff, as fish are able to do, at least in Professor Final's lab, and they're able to do, if he defeats him and he defeats me, I better give that guy a subordinating gesture. We've now just fit together two of those pieces, establishing the dyad beforehand, but what if the guy happens to be facing the other way and doesn't see him dominating him? And you've just lost the chance. Chance interactions wind up driving the system. Random movement of the animals and such winds up meaning knowing the starting states of the dominance relations of every single dyad gives you zero predictability of what the complex system is going to look like. So what we have over and over here is, amid this wonderful westernized focus on reductionism, and this is going to tell us exactly how complex systems work and know the starting state and know the full one. We're seeing here over and over in biological systems, ranging from behavior of entire organisms down to genes, reductive systems break down, because there's simply not enough pieces in there to explain complex function in a point-for-point reductive component part broken down, add them up together afterward way, and there's no way to deal with the fact that chance plays a role in biological systems. So what have we just gotten to here, 500 years or so into this reductive program? What we're seeing is, if you kind of are interested in behavior or the brain or any of that stuff, what you've just discovered is the most interesting domains of brain function, of genetic regulation. The most interesting stuff can't be regulated in a classical reductive way. It breaks down there. It can't be that way. It's got to be something else. So what this will do now is transition us into this whole issue of chaotic systems. What happens when you have a system that is not reductive, where there is non-linear non-additivity, where you suddenly have a very different picture? If a clock is broken, you take the pieces apart and you find the one tooth and one gear there that's missing, and you fix that, and you now are able to put the pieces back together in an additive way, and you will have fixed the clock. A clock can be fixed using reductive point-for-point knowledge. Now you have a problem with something else. You have a cloud that doesn't rain enough during a drought. How are you going to figure out what's wrong? I know, let's divide the cloud in half, and then get better tools so we can divide each half into half, and each half into half, and eventually we'll get like one molecule worth of cloud and a gazillion of them, and we understand how each one of them works and put it together, and then we'll understand why there's a drought. It doesn't work that way. Reductive approaches can be used to fix clocks. Reductive approaches can't be used to understand why clouds don't rain. And the whole point of all chaos in these lectures here is, when you look at the interesting complex biological systems, they're clouds, they're not clocks. You need a whole different explanatory system. So let's take a 5-minute break, and we will transition to beginning to look at what chaoticism is about. Reductive science, showing that westernized reductionism is really good for fairly uncomplicated systems, breaking down into component parts. The whole world of the stuff we find interesting, it can't work because there's not enough component parts, there's not a blueprint that has enough elements in it, and because of the role of chance. And what this transitions us into are non-linear systems, non-additive systems, where you break something down to its component parts, and you study all those pieces, and you put it back together again, and it's going to be different. They've added up differently. You understand the starting point in a system, and you are going to have no predictability about what the complex form is about, because the pieces don't add up in a straight linear manner. Okay, what do I mean by this? As we begin to approach this, what is chaoticism about? Here we have a distinctive thing. We have a difference between two different ways in which things can be deterministic. Here's a no, you're just coming up with a number series. And there's a rule. There's a rule which determines what the next number is going to be in the sequence, which is just add 1. This is a determinist system. It is a periodic one in that knowing what the rule is and knowing which point you're at, someone could say, what's it going to be in 15 steps down the line there? And you don't need to say, well, number 1 is going to be 5, number 2 is going to be 6, you don't need to do that. You recognize a periodicity that allows you to predict pieces way down the line simply by applying the same determinist rule over and over. This would be a system that's both determinist and periodic. Now, in contrast, you can get a system which is determinist but aperiodic, which is where we're heading very quickly. You have some system where there's a sequence of numbers, there's a sequence of places on a three-dimensional matrix, there's a sequence, and there are rules for how you go from each step to the next one. But the thing is, you can't just apply the same rule over and over. You cannot sit here and say, if we start at number 5, and given what the rule is, I know what it's going to look like 10 of these down. The only way to know is to see what 5 produces as the first step, what that produces as the second step. You cannot see periodicity. You could not see patterns that repeat. The only way to know the complex form is to go stepwise and apply the rule over and over again. Because the relationship between any one step here is going to be different from any other one. Here it's always the same. Each one is 1 higher. Straightforward, additive, you just keep doing it over and over again. In an aperiodic system, you have rules, it's determinist, but the rules are such that the spaces, the difference with each step is not constant. The only way you could know what the number is going to be like X number of rounds down is you got to do this, and then this, and then this, and then this. This is an aperiodic system. At any given one of these points, the rules exist for you to know what the next one is going to be. But the rules don't exist for you to know what the 1, 2 down is going to be unless you figure out what this one is. You've got to march through in that sort of way. It's aperiodic. There are no patterns that can be used over and over again. Third version is one that's like that people mistake for what I'm talking about here, which is a system which is non-determinist because there's randomness in there. And in that one, going from this one to the next one, there's no rule. It's totally random what the next number is going to be. And the one after that is totally random. And that one, you have no predictability. You're going to have to go every single step down the line, but it's not a determinist system. There's no set of rules that are being applied over and over again. The nature of this one does not specify the nature of that. It's not determinist in that way. That's not what we're going to be interested in here, where randomness comes in. What all of these nonlinear systems are about, these chaotic systems, are ones where they are determinist. There's rules for how you go every step along the way, but the relationship given any given step is nonlinear. They're not identical, and thus the only way to know what's happening 2 down from here is to know what's happening 1 down. The only way to do that, and thus, by definition, this cannot be a system where knowing the starting state allows you to know the mature system without having to go through every single calculation, and knowing the mature state doesn't tell you what the starting state was unless you're willing to do all the back calculations, because it's not reductive in that sense. Where would this begin to sort of manifest itself? Okay, into the chaos book, and I think it was page 27 or so, that you get the water wheel coming up for the first time, and go and look at this picture, obsess over it, understand what that page is about, because it begins to show how these properties of nonlinear aperiodicity wind up producing chaotic systems. Okay, so you've got this water wheel, and it's got these buckets here, and they've got holes in the bottom. And you can have a very simple steady state. You just put in a little bit of water such that the water is basically, as soon as it gets here, it's running out, it's coming out to the same state. This never fills, the water wheel doesn't turn. Now you begin to fill up at a higher rate, and what that does is it's a little bit asymmetrical. This is heavy enough that it now begins to push the wheel down. And as it's going down, this next one is getting filled, and this next one, and all the while it's emptying out. So constant input of water, a rate of things emptying, the wheel turns. It's possible to get a rate at which you're pouring water into the system where it will do precisely that for the rest of time. It will turn at a set speed. It is a steady state, is in the equilibrium state. It is stable such that if you sit here right now and somebody tells you, in this circumstance like this, the wheel is turning this fast in this direction with this force, you can sit there and you can tell them thus exactly what it will be doing 4,070 years from now on Tuesday afternoon. It is a periodic system. You don't have to sit there and go through every second between now and 4,000 years from now. It is steady state, and you can apply a periodic, there's periodicity, there's a reductive quality to it. Now what you do is you put in the water with a little more force. And what begins to happen is the wheel turns faster, because though it's filling up with water faster, so it's moving this way faster, and that's great, that's totally logical. But at some point, if you're doing that, there's going to be too little time for these buckets to empty out. They're going to start having more water when they're coming up on this side, because it's moving fast enough that they're not emptying, and at some point, there's going to be enough water left here that it will suddenly change direction. Okay. It's possible, if you get the water pressure just right, that you can get a steady state pattern there. It will go around 3 times when you're putting water with this speed. It will go around 3 times at this speed and with this force, and when it has gone around 3.73 times, it will change direction for 1.7 turns, and then it will go 3.7 times around. And once again, it's a periodicity. It's simply a periodicity with 2 components to it. 2 changes of directions. First time, you're going this way, and oops, this fills up. So you have your first change of direction, and then at some point, the balance is such that you get your second change of direction, and you start the process all over again. There's a pattern, a periodic pattern to it that just happens to have 2 components. You've doubled the number of components in it by putting more force in the system, but once you understand that rule, okay, at this speed, at this rate, with this force of water, it's going to change direction at this point for this length of time, then it's going to change direction again. Knowing that, you can now sit here and be told exactly how full, how fast, with what force, and you could now tell exactly what this water wheel is going to be doing 4,700 years from now. It is still a reductive periodic system. Now you put in the water with even more force. And what you begin to see is, as the wheel is moving fast enough, it will have sort of this first spin in this direction, and then it will change direction. And because the buckets are now emptying out that much slower compared to the rate at which the water is coming in, it will change direction once more, and once more back this way. And you're back to your starting point. In other words, now we have a completely periodic reductive system that has 4 components in it, 4 changes of directions before you get back to exactly the starting point and do it all over again. You've simply gotten a more complex version of a totally predictable periodic system. And what you see is, as you put in more and more water force in there, you keep getting doublings of your periods. You will now get spinning where it goes through 8 changes of directions before it starts the exact thing over again, and doing that, and you can still predict 4,000 years from now, 16, 32, all of that, and throughout you can be graphing in a sort of a way of representing it. This is the simple system here. That's the single rotation. Here's when you get a first doubling, and it does something like that. Here's when you get the point. You can represent it that way, and you see it is still, you let it keep running like this, and there will be the same periodicity, the same pattern that will go over and over for the rest of time. It's still a reductive periodic system, it's just gotten more complicated. And then, somewhere in the doubling process, something happens. And the something that happens is, it becomes a nonlinear, chaotic system. As you increase the force on the system, the force here being the force of water coming in there, at some point with the force of water increasing, it's going to stop this perfect periodic doubling of the components, and it's going to shift over to a chaotic pattern now. How do you define that as a chaotic pattern? It will shift over to a pattern of spinning this way and then back for a while and going with it. It will generate a pattern which never repeats. There's no periodicity anymore. It generates a pattern that is going to be infinitely different along the way because you're putting that much force in the system. It has become chaotic. And what is obvious here as an implication is knowing here gives you no predictive values ability of what's happening 4,000 years from now. The only way to know what's happening 4,000 years from now is to study what the wheel does for 4,000 years. You can't sit there and recognize a periodicity and just do it over again and again. And what the discovery of chaos was about was that in structured, reductive, linear systems, when you increase the amount of force on it, there's that doubling and quadrupling and all of that. It just gets more complicated and reductive, that there is a transition point where it suddenly becomes chaotic and the pattern never ever repeats and there's no predictability. And sort of the founding generation of chaoticists, this is what they were showing with things like water wheels, where you can see the exact same thing. You have a cylinder, and what you're applying in here, and it's filled with water, and you're applying heat to the system. And what you begin to get after a while is convections, or whatever it's called. Stuff moves, and as you put in the heat it even more, it changes direction. It's the same thing, and at some point when the heat gets high enough, it breaks into boiling, it breaks into turbulence, it breaks into a chaotic system where there's no periodicity, there's no repeating of these patterns. And an amazing insight by one of the first people in the field, this guy York, was that any time you see periodicity of an odd number, you've just guaranteed that you've entered chaotic terrain. That, as he called it, period 3, as soon as you're going instead of a single period, a double, 4, 8, whatever, as soon as you see the first evidence, as soon as any system like this begins to have 3 components before the pattern repeats, it's about to disappear into chaoticism. So this is what a chaotic system is about, which is you have a starting state, and as you increase the force on the system, the periodicity, the predictability breaks down, and eventually you get, as the critical thing, a pattern which never repeats. And thus, the only way to know what that pattern will be doing X amount of time down the line is to run the system from now until time X. There's no predictability from here as to what's happening at X. You gotta sit there and march through it because it's an aperiodic system rather than one like this. So what the entire sort of starting point for chaoticists was that you get these nonlinear systems, and people have been noting them, mathematicians, physicists, whatever, in systems like that for a long time. And what would they do right around the point that things would become chaotic? They would say, well, this is just getting perturbed by now. It's not functioning properly anymore because it's not working in a linear, periodic manner. Something's wrong with the system. Something along the lines of noise and variability. We will stop studying it up to that point. And if you say, we're going to stop studying it until it gets to that point, the last bit of periodicity, what do you come away with? A very distorted view that all the interesting things in the world work in reductive periodic systems. Because what you've just done is say, I'm getting totally disturbed by these nonlinear chaotic things that happen at an extreme, so I'm going to decide they're just anomalies, and we're only going to study in this domain and reach the conclusion that the entire world works in this domain. Kind of like behavior geneticists who say, ooh, I want to understand the heritability of a trait, and I want to understand it very cleanly, so we're going to study it in only one environment. Because if you study it in a bunch of environments, it gets noisy and variable and messy data. No, it doesn't. It is showing you that the heritability is zilch. It's showing you that you have just artificially excluded your ability to see what's actually happening. And the founding generation of the chaoticists took the stance that what you've got is all the interesting stuff about complex systems out there are all functioning out in the chaotic realm, and what science has been spending forever doing is looking the other way and pretending it's not there and restricting the studying of complex systems to just these first baby step domains of the periodic doubling. Most of the world is doing this, and most of science has worked very, very hard to ignore this. So once you get this, you begin to get some really interesting implications. So now you find a way, you get one of these chaotic systems, and you first study it when it is still in the nice, straightforward, periodic way. A little bit of water is coming in, and it's turning like this at a set speed, and come back 4,000 years from now, and it'll still be doing the exact thing. It's a great periodic system, and you can come up with a graph of which direction it's turning, would be here or here, and how fast, with what force, whatever, and you will come up with a single dot which represents this rotating in this direction at this set speed, and this is this point of stability, this point of complete predictability. A feature of a periodic system like this, when it's in this boring linear reductive way, is you can mess with it, and after a little bit of time, it will settle back into the same system. You briefly hold the water wheel, and that throws things off, and then you let it go, and it goes back to what it was doing, and it will take a little bit of time for it to go back to where it started. And a way of viewing this graphically is it's doing this forever, and now you go mess with it, you hold it, you turn off the water for a second, whatever, and for a while it does this, and it does this, and does this, and does this, and eventually it gets pulled back to this spot. It goes back to this point of stability, of predictability. It is attracted to this point. And thus linear systems like this have attractors, something where when you mess with it, the system will equilibrate and go back to where it was, attracted to the real solution to the problem. And if you're looking at it at any point here, and it's not here, because it's here instead, and it's here instead, and here instead, all that is noise in the system, and you're in the process of getting rid of the noise back to the pure, perfect state, the pure, perfect description of how the system works. So now you look at what's going on when instead you've got it to the point of chaos, a chaotic system. And what you see is, okay, let's assume that was where the attractor was. And what you see is when you're mapping the speed, the direction that it's turning, the force, all of that, it's doing this. and it will do this for a while, and we'll do this, and it will reach that critical point where suddenly it changes direction, and we'll do this for a while, and then it will change direction again, and then this and this, and what you have is this butterfly wing pattern that became one of the iconic images in early chaos. What do you have here? You've got a description of how the system is working now. Once it's hit this chaoticism, it's not settling down into a repeating pattern. The fact that it is never here and staying there, that's the business that you could never predict. It is constantly oscillating. It is constantly chaotic. So now you ask, and you say, well, that's pretty strange, because it's not actually touching this spot, but it just keeps going around it. It's clearly pulled to it, but in a very different sort of way than when you get a perturbation, and quickly it does this.
Stanford University.
Let's get started. We switch to our next subject, where the overall plan could be summarized like that, as you well know by now. Looking at language, looking at the biological roots of the interactions with environment, all the deal that we have under our belts by now. Same strategy as usual, starting off with the behavior and then working our way back. First off, two announcements before I forget. One is we're not going to have a lecture on depression. The remaining lectures will be Wednesday is schizophrenia, Friday is biology of religion, and the following Wednesday is the final lecture, personality disorders, individual differences. And apropos of that, not positive at the moment, but I'm leaning towards the last two lectures not being taped. For a number of reasons. Okay, also one final point from Wednesday, from Friday's lecture, the complexity one, back to that business, swarm intelligence, and being able to solve the traveling salesman problem for you with remarkable efficiency. That business again about how the cortex wires up that two-generation business of cells, the first cells being those radial glia that establish sort of a superstructure, the second generation then being the neurons to do the random wandering, hit and grow up there, and then wire up in these sort of optimal nodes. What you also get is a version intrinsic in that is solving the traveling salesman problem. If you think about it, if you've got 20, 30 billion cortical neurons there, and all of them are wiring up to like 10,000 other neurons, depending on how efficiently you pack it, you could have 100 gazillion miles of axons that you have to grow, or just a couple of kilometers worth. And again, the pressure is to come up with the traveling salesman efficiency to be able to pull off the wiring that you want with the minimal amount of expenditure of axons. And what you see
Stanford University.
Okay, good. Thank you for notching me once more. Okay, so various organizational things now that we are here in the last gasp. One thing is make sure you go online, fill out the online evaluations. The other is various review stuff. The TAs are giving a review tomorrow from dawn until 3:30. What time are you guys starting? 1:30 to 3:30 where? 3:21, okay. Read it on the board, unlike me. I will pick up on office hours then from 3:30 to 6. And operators will be standing by overnight, but I think that's the preparative stuff. Let's see, before starting this last lecture, something that absolutely has to be done is to once again emphasize what an amazing bunch of TAs you guys lucked out in having. I've been doing this class for hundreds of years, and these guys are peerless, so thank them. They have been amazing in every regard. Okay, I guess it needs to be notched down. Okay, so we start off, and Thank you, guys. You really were amazing. So starting off, what's a lot of what we have been doing for the last 30 lectures or whatever it is here? We've often been wrestling with a behavior occurs, an interesting behavior, a social behavior, an abnormal behavior, a destructive one. A behavior occurs, and obviously our centerpiece throughout has been, why did it happen? And all of our buckets and our buckets that we have magically evaporated, and at the core over and over with the why did this happen is another question that lurks through there. Simply because very often we are not asking why did this behavior occur, some human social behavior that's completely benign, but often some fairly disastrous ones. Why did this behavior occur? Very often what is between the lines there is, whose fault is it? Whose fault is it that this abnormal behavior occurred? And where that immediately barrels us into is back to the frontal cortical sections of earlier lectures, that whole business of volition and culpability, and God help me for saying the phrase again, the first time since the first lecture, free will, things of that sort. Quick survey, how many of you are finishing the class less wedded to the notion of free will than when you started? Okay, more so? No change whatsoever? What did I say? Can you repeat that? Hands up. Okay, so a number of you. And ultimately, this material, no single factoid, but I think all of it together is a hugely complicating issue for notions of free will, for notions of vulnerability, for notions of culpability, all of that built around this question often lurking between the lines, which is, why did that behavior occur? Whose fault is it? As a boring subset of that one is, why did this behavior occur? Who is worthy of praise for it? That one is ultimately equally interesting, but probably less pressing in society, but where are these behaviors coming from? And we've gotten really good at doing some moderately sophisticated things in dealing with the answer to a question like these. And a great example of that is with epilepsy. 500 years ago, if you had an epileptic seizure, where is this behavior coming from was absolutely clear, which was demonic possession of some sort of other, a staggering, heartbreaking literature of the history of treatments of epileptics and the response to epilepsy. If in the process of somebody having a seizure 500 years ago, they flung their arms around and struck somebody else in the process, it would be considered some version of assault and battery in most Western European countries. Again, explained with a demonic underpinning, and we're in a different position now. If today somebody has a seizure and in the process they strike and break something, they're not to be held legally responsible for it. If they strike somebody, that is not assault and battery. It is a ludicrous idea, because somewhere around 1900 or so, most people in this country got trained with a thought, an explanation of where did this behavior come from that is as defining of everything that is good about our current world. Most people got taught to think the following thing: it's not him, it's his disease. And that is a huge landmark transition from 500 years ago, people being burned at the stake with some really bad attribution given, to us having the capacity to draw an absolute line between the essence of who that person is and the action potential storms that happen every now and then. It's not him, it's his disease. We're spectacular at doing something like that with epilepsy. We are lousy at doing it in all sorts of other domains. One example, schizophrenia. Back to schizophrenia again, and the abnormal behaviors of it, and the occasional violence associated with it, lower than in non-schizophrenic people, but the occasional violence, and of course, the classic case again, that guy John Hinckley trying to kill Reagan in the 1980s, paranoid schizophrenic, floridly so, and that very wise jury of, in retrospect, some remarkably unsophisticated people decided admitting it's not him, it's his disease, and put him in a psychiatric hospital, and the apoplexy that went through this country in response to it, the editorials, the senatorial bloviating crap about he's getting away with this, he's getting away, he is responsible, showing an utterly limited ability for people in this country, and some extremely powerful ones, to draw a line between the essence of who this John Hinckley is and the dopamine abnormalities in his brain. And we have trouble drawing that line as well, for example, in the realm of parents and teachers and guidance counselors making sense of the biology of learning disabilities, the biology of dyslexias, and a whole world of people not very good yet at drawing a line between that and the person, and instead out come concepts like lazy and stupid and things of that sort that have a long, well-maintained legacy in sort of the history of education in this country, and an awful lot of people in positions of power, parents et al., still have not gotten very good at drawing the line between the essence of who that person is and the biological constraints that are superimposed on top of it. What you begin to see after a while is something very interesting, which is going to be one of the main points of this last lecture, which is as more and more information in this world of behavioral, sociobiology, whatever it is we're calling this, as more and more of this has occurred, as we get more and more domains where we have to at least begin to consider there's a line in between the essence of and the abnormalities of, at some point, this is going to stop being the biology of them and their disorders and is going to be the biology of us. And when things get really close to home at that point, that's where a lot of people get very, very anxious and very skittish about essentially the punchline from a class like this. The transition from them and their existing in a different category with a boundary, with a bucket, versus the rest of us, as it gets closer and closer to home, the transition from them and disease to us and individual differences and quirks and idiosyncrasies and a biology that is just as much of a biology as them and their diseases, where the subtleties come in. And where there has to have been that case, sort of that sense challenging, is looking at some of the subtle neuropsychiatric disorders that we have in the class, few of which I'll go over again here, but a few new ones where over and over it's the theme of there's not that much difference between me and them. I imagine exactly what the continuum is. It is not clear whatsoever where the line should be drawn in the new category of normal versus abnormal, case after case of this. One obvious one, most recently emphasized, schizotypalism, schizotypal personality disorder. And when you look at the range of symptoms, this is not a psychiatric disorder. This really is not, and justifies the transition to schizotypal personality rather than a disorder. It isn't a psychiatric disease to consult astrologers. It isn't a psychiatric disease to go to Star Trek conventions. It isn't any of these things. It is one extreme and one axis of human behavior, and it is one where, by definition, we're beginning to sense the biology of it lurking around out there. We know it's got something to do with the same genetics that you find in a fuller loaded version in schizophrenia itself. We could begin to imagine that this is the biology of us and some of our quirky obsessions versus them and their schizophrenia. More examples. We endlessly heard about the frontal lobe in this class. We heard about the boring, easy example versus them and their schizophrenia. More examples. We endlessly heard about the frontal lobe in this class, and we heard about the boring, easy examples, when it is blown out of the water, when you have Phineas Gage, when you have have frontally damaged, disinhibited murderers. We've heard all about those, and those are the easy ones. Those are not so easy if the vast majority of states in this country cannot deal with the notion at a criminal trial that somebody with no frontal cortex is not a biologically normal human. But nonetheless, that's relatively easy compared to the issue that we really have to think about, which is the person sitting next to you has a different frontal cortex than you do. And you by now can come up, yes, it's the person on the left, seeing her sort of where the eyes are shifting, and coming up with this obvious fact that this makes a difference. This makes a difference not in explaining why one person in here might be a serial murderer and the next person not, but just the who's got it together with the studying, who's going to do an all-nighter Thursday night, who has what sort of personality, who is too shy to say something or other, who's the one who is always the first to say, and this world of individual differences. And you have no shortage by now of ways in which that may manifest itself, how many neurons and how many synapses and what sort of receptors and all of that. You could go on all week long as to the possible underpinnings of that, and you could go on all week long as to what events, genetic, prenatal, etc., might have brought that about. But the whole critical thing there is the transition from them and their brains with no frontal cortex left to making sense of the fact that all of us with perfectly normal frontal cortices nonetheless all have different ones. And at some point, this transition brings the term frontal disinhibition out of the realm of pathology. I mean, great example of this in terms of how sort of commonplace this now is among sort of biological psychiatry types. You'll be at some conference and some poor, quivering grad student gets up to give a short talk, and this is the first talk the person ever gave, and they're obviously like a total nervous wreck, and they manage to sort of limp through the end, and they're a sopping rag at the end there, but they done okay, and it was good. And then some total jerk big shot in the field gets up from the back row and savages the guy and gets him on stupid statistics, minutia, and chest thumps, and attacks his enemies and yells at him for not citing his, and going on and on. And somebody is going to lean over to somebody else in the audience and referring to the guy back saying, Jesus, he is getting more frontal every day. And that may not just be a metaphor. That may be a way of hinting at the biology that is absolutely there, why some of us do some things like that, and some of us would die rather than be that forward or that disinhibited, those individual differences. And we surely know they are there, and we are beginning to understand the baby steps of different versions of dopamine receptors in the frontal cortex, that whole world of transitioning from them and the front of their head blown out of the water to us and our individual differences. Another domain of this, another realm of insight, and that's this disease, Huntington's disease. And you will perhaps recall back to the very first class, making reference to what turned out to be Huntington's, what is very often the profile of somebody with Huntington's, middle-aged guy, suddenly starts behaving in some outrageous way, disinhibited, all of that. That whole business of there's behavioral features to this disease. Huntington's disease is a neurological disorder. Huntington's chorea, other term chorea, choreography, body movement. Huntington's uncontrolled writhing that eventually consumes the entire body 24/7. The person eventually, not so long, soon, dies from choking to death on their saliva because their muscles aren't coordinated anymore. Totally horrible neurological disease. But what has taken people years is to realize that that's not what Huntington's looks like at the beginning. And instead, it's the profile, the scenario that I gave in the very first class. Again, middle-aged guy, happy marriage, in the suburbs, jobs, 2.73 kids and dogs, all of that sort of thing. And the one day he suddenly punches somebody at work. Then the wife discovers he's having an affair with whoever. Then he gets arrested for brawling drunkenly in a bar and he never used to drink. And then he embezzles all the funds from work and disappears forever. Until a year or two later, when he shows up in a neurology ward at the other end of the country because he's getting tremors. And what people have now figured out is 2 or 3 years before Huntington's is a neurological disorder of movement, it's a psychiatric disorder of disinhibition. It is one where you begin to see a behavioral profile like this. And what you see is, by the time you've got early stage Huntington's patients, when they're hospitalized, they are famous for coming on to the staffers or showing up in the day room without their pajama bottoms or things, just famous for doing stuff like that, the disinhibited behavior of Huntington's patients. And what's remarkable there is people have known for a long time what the sort of neuropathology is of Huntington's. Huntington's, the movement disorder, and it's a disintegration of some motor pathways in the brain. Now that people have genetic markers for the disease, know with some likelihood who's going to get it when, what's become apparent now is 2 or 3 years before you start getting damage in the part of the brain having to do with motor control, you get damage in the frontal cortex. Huntington's is initially a disease of frontal cortical degradation. And what is remarkable about that is this is a genetic disorder which immediately barrels us into this is a maladaptive trait. You are dead by the time you're 50 or so. Our usual question, why is it evolving? Why is it being maintained in the population? Seeing a theme of a hidden benefit of Huntington's, which is that disinhibited behavior a couple of years before the neurological symptoms do you in. During that time window, individuals with Huntington's out-reproduce their unaffected siblings. They become, among other things, sexually promiscuous, and they pass on more copies of their genes. And what you suddenly see at that point is, framed from the standpoint of arms that won't stop moving, we're talking neurology, framed from the standpoint of number of copies of genes, and this is an evolutionary advance. This is something which behaviorally increases reproductive success. Onset is typically around age 40. So catching it around that time, which is typically around the point where reproductive activity, sort of reproduction, goes down in humans. So getting an extra little blip out there from the standpoint of an evolutionary biologist, this isn't a disease, this is a great invention where the bill happens to come a while later, but there's no free lunch. And framed that way, this is a very different way of thinking about this disease. But what was most striking is when you first hear about it and somebody says, okay, what do you think the causes of this behavior are? What causes this? And the ones that most readily come to mind is the guy's a jerk. The guy's having a midlife crisis. The guy's like, oh, no, it's actually a single gene defect where there's too many glutamines coded. And it's a disease of a single gene goes wrong, and out comes this, and all we need to consider is there's individual variation in aspects of that system long far outside the range of what would get a disease label. And it doesn't take too much imagination, again, to translate that into why the person sitting next to you is a little more this way and a little less that way. Just the same challenge for us, going from them to what makes us us. Next example, disease I've only briefly mentioned, I think, previously, Tourette's disease.
This lecture and the next are probably the most explicitly philosophical lectures of the course. Then we move into psychometrics and biological psychology, really, and those are going to be the most scientific lectures of the course. I was thinking this morning about, when I was preparing this lecture, about why I approach these topics this way. I guess part of the answer is probably that it isn't clear that the study of personality, at least insofar as the concern is to further the development of personality, which is a concern that's associated with the desire for mental health or subjective well-being, which is a term I really don't like, or meaning, it's not clear that those can be strictly scientific pursuits. So then if they're not strictly scientific pursuits, what should you do about understanding them? look at studies after studies, the problem with that is you get a very narrow slice of the domain, and it's often not very comprehensible, because in order to understand the results of a study, you have to have the knowledge, the underlying knowledge that's necessary to put the study in some sort of framework. And that framework is going to be developed by studying the relevant scientific literature and psychological literature, but behind that, the framework has to be expanded to include the relevant philosophical assumptions. And I don't really think that you can understand the details without understanding the assumptions. I also think you're relegated to memorization if you don't understand the fundamentals. And memorization has very little to do with knowledge. I mean, you might be able to memorize procedures that would enable you to act on something, like perhaps to fix an automobile or to repair or to play a piece on the piano, and it's not like those things are not worth doing, but for these ideas to take root and have effect and meaning, you have to understand them at the right level of analysis. One of the things I really like about personality theory, especially the clinical end of it, although not exclusively the clinical end of it, is that the people who were conducting clinical practice and writing clinical theory during the 20th century were in fact dealing with the most profound problems that affect people. I mean, I started my academic career as a political scientist. Well, insofar as you're any sort of political scientist when you're an undergraduate. I was not interested in it at all by my third year, because what I found was that, at least at this time, and I don't know how much it's changed, the political scientists had already decided that people were basically motivated by economic concerns. And to me, that just was no use at all, because I wanted to know why they were motivated by economic concerns. So it's easy to understand people in some sense if you already decide what they value. But if you can't figure out what they value or what they should value, that's a whole different issue. And that's psychology. It's a deep question, because it isn't even obvious whether the question, are there things you should value, is a reasonable question, or that it can be reasonably answered. The thing I can tell you about that that's most closely allied with my own experience, I don't mean personal experience, but say experience as a clinician, is that aimless people are in real trouble. Now, I don't necessarily know why that is, and